In this episode, I'm going to describe a tradition that most Americans have never even heard of. This tradition involves the idea that the relationship between God and his believers is defined by love, both because God loves his creation and because the most effective way to approach God is by cultivating love. This story begins in the city of Baghdad, which was created as the new capital of the Abbasid Empire in the middle of the 8th century. A focus on loving God arose simultaneously in several territories, but became particularly prominent in this city. During the 8th and 9th centuries, Baghdad was one of the most cosmopolitan and diverse cities in the world, and the multi-religious, multi-ethnic population of the city was involved in vigorous debates that had enormous ramifications for the development of European, Asian, and African history. Some of these debates were political. Shi'i Muslims were arguing that only direct male descendants of the Prophet's daughter, Fatima, and son-in-law, Ali, had the right to lead the Muslim community. They called these divinely chosen leaders imams, and various imams actually lived in Baghdad with their Shi'i supporters during this period. Many Muslim scholars argued that leadership should not be based on succession, but on righteousness and learning. Many of these early scholars developed the classical disciplines of Quranic interpretation and Islamic law. Over the course of 300 years, these scholars agreed to tolerate disagreements over legal interpretation in order to preserve a sense of community. This focus on scholarship and community ultimately became known as Sunnism. The rulers of the empire, called the Caliphs, gathered together experts from places as distant as India and Spain. They called in Jewish, Christian, Muslim, and Zoroastrian scholars, anyone who could read and write in Greek, Latin, Hebrew, Aramaic, Syriac, Persian, or Sanskrit, and they tasked these international scholars with translating the astrological, medicinal, and philosophic works of the ancient Greeks into Arabic. The effect of these efforts was the creation of an Arabic Islamic tradition of Greek philosophy and theology, as well as the development of new fields of study such as optics, algebra, and astronomy. 8th century Baghdad was a place where Muslims, Jews, and Zoroastrians debated the nature of God and prophecy, where Shi'is and Proto-Sunnis argued over leadership, where the first Muslim legal scholars interpreted the Quran and the sayings of Muhammad, and where powerful rulers cultivated discussions of Greek philosophy. And amid this intellectual fervor, a new movement arose. Increasingly, people began to refer to a new group of Muslims that they called Sufis. The first members of this group seemed to have been ascetics, people who sought to withdraw from the political, social, and even material worlds by embracing fasting and poverty. As the movement grew, these individuals and their students articulated a vision that rejected elite institutions of learning, arguing that these were tainted by their association with political leaders. Instead, they argued that God should be pursued through single-minded, wholehearted devotion and love, and that believers who followed the path of love could achieve direct, experiential knowledge of the divine. As this movement grew in popularity and spread out from Baghdad to the whole of the Abbasid Empire, specific individuals became renowned for their exceptional love and devotion to God and became known as the Friends of God. Many Muslims believed that the intense and single-minded devotions of these individuals caused them to not only love God, but also to be loved by God in return. And they often believed that God was more likely to respond to the prayers and requests of his friends, his beloveds. Today, there are shrines dedicated to the Friends of God around the world, in North and West Africa, Central and South Asia, China and Indonesia. And just as Muslims around the world travel to Mecca each year for the great pilgrimage, called the Hajj, so too do many Muslims undertake pilgrimages to these smaller shrines to ask God's particular friends to intercede on their behalf. And while the first Sufis rejected the legal and philosophical circles maintained by the Abbasid Caliphs, they did develop their own teaching circles and networks that transmitted their ideas to each new generation. As the movement expanded, these teaching lineages grew in both membership and complexity, some even organized into full-fledged institutions with leadership structures and rules for membership. As these teaching circles developed, members became just as intellectually sophisticated, their ideas just as elaborate and complex as the philosophers and theologians that their predecessors had rejected. By the 12th century, people who called themselves Sufis could be anything from illiterate, itinerant ascetics to educated philosophers and legal scholars. Because Sufi traditions of love lent themselves particularly well to poetry, some of the most historically influential Sufis were those who combined Sufi ideas with love poetry. In the 13th century, one Sufi philosopher and poet named Ibn Arabi would describe the path to God in these terms. Marvel, a garden among the flames. My heart can take on any form, a meadow for gazelles, a cloister for monks. For the idols, sacred ground, Kaaba for the circling pilgrim, the tables of the Torah, the scrolls of the Quran. I profess the religion of love. Wherever its caravan turns along the way, that is the belief, the faith I keep. The path of love described and developed by Sufis spread across the world, but these figures and their ideas also attracted criticism. Some Muslims objected to Sufi practices, particularly the traditions of visiting the shrines of God's friends, and accused Sufis of idolatry, of worshiping these humans in the place of God. These critics often stemmed from one particular legal school that became the prevailing institution in Saudi Arabia. As a result, although there are Sufis almost everywhere there are Muslims, there are no openly practicing Sufis today in Saudi Arabia, and very few in the neighboring Gulf states. Like Islam itself, Sufism has no one definition. It is made up of the voices and experiences of people who call themselves Sufis. In some places and regions, these lovers of God were pacifists. In others, they were dissidents. And in still others, Sufi leaders argued that their proximity to God gave them the right to rule. Sufi philosophy has been debated as thoroughly as Islamic law. Sufi poetry has been read by medieval Christian theologians and American hippies. And every year, millions of Muslims travel to visit Sufi shrines. And you probably hadn't even heard of Sufis before today. Why not? What forces shape the information that you have access to? Why do Americans have so many questions about Islamic law and so few about Islamic philosophy? And what else haven't you heard of? What questions do you not even know enough to ask?